Recently I've been trying to build some of the cheap and simple kits that I've got in the stash, you know, the sort of weekend builds or mojo build type of kits, just to move them on to make space for the other kits that inevitably are entering my stash and otherwise haven't got anywhere to go. And I thought to myself, yeah, this one will be nice and simple and easy to do, and then bam, 2 months later and I'm only just finishing it. So yeah, things get in the way, don't they? I mean, work and life just in general just get in the way, but it's done. It's finally done. So I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes. Welcome back to the workbench, because today I am building the Airfix Messerschmitt Bf109E-4 in 1/72 scale. So join me as I get this one down onto the workbench. So part of the reason I've decided to get this one out of the stash was because you guys kind of voted for it. It didn't win the vote, it actually came second, but that's a good enough excuse, I think, to get this one started. If you'd like to make sure that you can take part in any future polls I may have, make sure you're subscribed so that these votes appear in your feeds on YouTube. But without any further ado, let's get into this one. As is quite typical, I'll put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now. This should give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. I have already done a full unboxing video on this kit, so for a closer look at the sprues, the decals and the instructions, take a look at that dedicated video. In this one, I will be focusing on what the kit is like to build and then rounding off with a review at the end. As normal, I'll be cutting the parts away from the sprue using my side cutters and then carefully shaving away any excess flash or rough areas of plastic with my sanding stick. Tamiya extra thin cement is going to be my cement of choice during this build. And I'm going to start by assembling the various cockpit details. First are the rudder pedals, but actually, as per the instructions, because I want to include the pilot, I've cut the pedal parts away, so we just have the central support. This was then followed by the control column and the insertion of the pilot's seat. The control panel can then also be included. I'm now going to move on to join the upper and lower wing halves together. You do get the option to display this aircraft with its landing gear raised or lowered. I'm going to assemble mine in a lowered position. The landing gear legs were glued onto the respective door covers. I've done all of these stages at this point because I'm ready to start airbrushing, and actually I've been very fortunate to receive a Gallery Mobius 0.3mm airbrush to try out. This is a free sample and all opinions do remain my own, but thanks to Gallery for sending this one out. I thought this would be the perfect kit to try it out because it does have a slightly more complicated paint scheme. Not only do we have solid camouflage colours, but we also have a bit of mottling, which I would like to try out on this one. Aesthetically, this airbrush does look a little different to the other Gallery airbrushes that I've had in the past. It does look a little more refined. But let's get this one to work and see how it actually performs. I'll put a little bit of information up on the screen now about the different PSIs that I used during this build, but generally it was between 10 and 15 PSI and the paint was thinned to about 2:1, but it really depends on the specific paint and what I'm trying to do with it. So to prepare the surfaces of the plastic of all the parts I've already assembled, I'm going to be using some SMS Surfacer Grey. This primer is lacquer based, and as it comes airbrush ready, it was loaded into my airbrush. The various parts were then given a few thin coats of this lacquer-based primer. It dries quite quickly, so actually you can make quite quick progress here. As I've prepared all of the internal areas, I need some appropriate paints. Fortunately, thanks to the support of my Model Club members on Patreon and here on YouTube, I've been able to purchase some Vallejo paint sets recently. This Luftwaffe paint set features all of the main colours that I'll need during this build. A massive thanks to my Model Club members who are on screen now for the extra support they give the channel. And to find out what becoming a Model Club member means, take a look at the links in the description. So first up is Vallejo RLM02 Grey. This is airbrush ready, but I find that I get less tip dry if I actually thin it down slightly. So I added just a couple of drops of Humbrol acrylic thinners to the paint whilst it was in the airbrush. I'll do this for most of the paints during this build as well. This was then airbrushed onto all of the internal areas of the aircraft, including the cockpit, the hubs of the wheels, the internal landing gear bays, and those landing gear legs and doors. When that paint was dry, I carefully painted the tyres on the wheels with Vallejo black, and I also used this to pick out some of the internal details inside the fuselage. The pilot would also have his flying helmet and boots picked out in this colour as well. I decided that Vallejo US Field Drab would be the overall colour for the pilot figure, and some army painter Peachy Flesh was used on his face. Vallejo Khaki was used on his flying gloves, whilst English Uniform was used on the straps of his harness, and then gunmetal paint was used on the front of the harness as well as his flying goggles. I think that for a pilot that's going to go in the cockpit, this is a good enough finish. I'll move on now to use some Humbrol decal fix to help apply the transfer that goes on the control panel inside the cockpit. After this was done, I glued into place the reflector gun sight. This is a clear part, but I have painted the lower portion in black. I thinned down some Humbrol blue-grey enamel wash with some enamel thinner, and this was applied to all of the elements that I've already completed, including the internal cockpit area, the pilot, and the internal fuselage walls. Not forgetting the landing gear bays as well. This should add some contrast and the impression of dirt and grime. I then applied some dry brushing using some Humbrol 01 Primer Grey. This should help highlight all of the raised details and add further contrast. When that was dry, the pilot could then be glued into his chair, and this cockpit assembly was added into one of the fuselage halves. And with that done, the two fuselage halves can be joined together, sandwiching the cockpit between them. The fit of this kit has been quite good so far, with no real major issues. Components for the lower nose, engine cowling and air intake are assembled here, and then these are added into place on the bottom of the aircraft. Whilst Airfix does give you an impression of an engine in the nose of the aircraft, and you could potentially have the cowling removed, I decided that for this build I would just glue my cowling into place. This air intake on the side of the nose can then be glued into position as well. The wings were then glued onto the fuselage. Another new product that I've been wanting to try out recently is this Ammo MIG Putty Surfacer. I've got the medium version here. This is a liquid kind of filler that I've not used before, but I applied it to the various joints and areas that required a bit more attention and left it to dry. Having done that, these areas were then sanded down nice and smooth. I did find that in a few places I'd lost some of the panel lines due to the filler clogging them up, so I just opened them up again using this scribing tool. I then moved on to glue into place the horizontal tail surfaces, and then the rudder would also join them. The next step was a little fiddly, and that was adding on the tail braces. I did have to take care here to make sure it was in the right place and everything was level. Next, I glued into place the two underwing radiators, and then the flaps were glued in a lowered position. You can display the flaps in a raised position as an alternative if you'd prefer, but I decided I wanted to have mine lowered. The 20mm cannon barrels were then glued into their holes in the wings, and the pitot tube was glued into its hole on the lower side of the wing, not forgetting the weight balancers on the ailerons. These are small little fiddly parts, and I kind of wish Airfix had given us a spare, just in case you end up losing one. The clear canopy parts are generally moulded to an acceptable quality, but there is some excess flash and a few scratches here and there that may benefit from cleaning up. To make masking the canopy a bit easier though, I've been fortunate enough to receive a free sample of the CT Scale Models mask set for this particular aircraft. I've been quite impressed with CT Scale Models masks recently, having used them on a number of builds. Once again, opinions do remain my own, but this is a range of products that I've been rather enjoying. So thanks to CT Scale Models for providing this review sample. Application of this mask set is really simple. You locate the correct piece of masking tape for the relevant window pane, peel it from the backing paper, and then stick it in the right place on the canopy. I have been of the habit recently where I cut my own masks, but this just saves so much time. I'm definitely being converted to getting aftermarket canopy masks if they're not included in the kit. It just makes this step so much easier. When that was done, I used some Humbrol Clear Fix to glue the various canopy elements into place. I do want to display my canopy open at the end of the build, but for now I'll glue it in a closed position just so that it will protect the internal cockpit area from any subsequent layers of paint. I'm also going to pop into place the raised landing gear components to act as masks for the landing gear bays. These will be removed later on. I also glued into place the aerial mast at the back of the cockpit. And then it was time to prime again. So first up were the landing gear legs. This is the outside, in preparation for their camouflage colour. I also primed the engine exhausts because they'll need painting and adding to the model later. Then after this, the entire aircraft assembly was given a coat of this primer. It should help ensure that any subsequent layers of paint stick to it. Once again, I'm going to be using the camouflage colours provided in this Vallejo Luftwaffe set, and adding a drop or two of acrylic thinner just to prevent any tip dry. I'm using this RLM 65 colour as my lower side paint. This was painted onto the outside covers of the landing gear and the lower side and fuselage sides of the aircraft. To try and make the camouflage a little bit neater, I've actually bought this AML camouflage painting mask set. These are vinyl self-adhesive masks which you just apply to the aircraft. However, I did find that they don't really follow the sort of scheme or method that I would prefer to paint this kit in. So I prefer to work from light to dark, but I found that I had to paint some of the darker colours, then mask them and then do a lighter colour on top of that, which is not my preferred way of doing things, but it was possible. These are definitely masks that work reasonably well, and I would consider buying more of these in the future. I just didn't think that perhaps the ones they'd cut were the ones that I would have chosen, if that makes sense. I'd much prefer to have masked all the light colours, then moved on to the darker colours, but that's not the way that this mask sheet is set out. These are peeled from their sheets and then stuck into place. It is a little fiddly, but for the most part everything is cut to the right size, so I didn't really find I had to use too much of my own masking tape for this step. Firstly, I'm going to paint the wing and tail tips in RLM 04 yellow, as indicated by the paint scheme. Not forgetting, of course, the propeller spinner, as this also needs to be yellow. After this, the next paint was RLM 71 dark green, and this was airbrushed onto the upper surfaces of the wing. The next paint was RLM 02 grey. And you can see that I've applied the vinyl masks to protect the dark green, and now have to go over the top with the grey lighter colour. It will take a little more paint in order to do this, to ensure that I have good opacity. Once that was done though, and it had dried, I was pretty impressed with the neat edges these vinyl masks have given me. And top tip, you can actually put them back on the sheet and save them for another aircraft if you haven't thrown them away, provided they're still sticky of course. I had made a little bit of mess in a few places with some overspray, so these were fixed up using the relevant RLM65 colour on the fuselage. It was then time to carefully remove most of the vinyl masks, in preparation for some mottling. I do struggle with mottling at times, and I feel like I have done better mottling on other aircraft that I've built in the past. This aircraft is quite small, and whilst I do have a 0.3mm nozzle on this Mobius airbrush, I think that there is a 0.2 version which would probably have given much finer results. Also, I think maybe had I thinned down the paint a little more, that may have helped a little bit, but I did drop the pressure of my compressor as much as possible to try and give a little more controllability. This was a slightly time-consuming step, but after a while and a little bit of trial and error, I think I got to a point where I was reasonably happy with it. Not 100% happy, but good enough. Up next, I'm going to load this Humbrol clear gloss varnish into my airbrush and then just simply spray it over the entire aircraft. This should even out the finish and give a nice smooth surface for the subsequent transfers to be applied. And speaking of the transfers, they were cut into more manageable sections. These are printed by Cartograph and they are absolutely fantastic. However, I did find it a little bit annoying the amount of tiny stencils that are included in this kit. Airfix indicates that this is a skill level 1 kit, but given the paint scheme and the number of transfers, some of them being absolutely minute, I'm not entirely sure I agree with that particular skill level. Granted, the kit itself might not be too difficult to build, but these other elements I wouldn't have attempted as a beginner. I mean, I've been modelling for years now and I've only now just built this kit. That's how sort of off-putting this particular paint scheme was. With the transfers now cut into more manageable sheets, they were soaked in warm water to help them release from the backing paper. As usual, I'll be using micro scale set and sol as my setting solutions during this build. The micro set from the blue bottle was painted onto the relevant areas where the transfers were going to go, and then once they had released from the backing paper, they were carefully slid into position. Some more micro set might be applied on the top just to help soften them into the surface details. I didn't have any real issues applying the transfers other than the fact it just took a while because there were so many of them for such a small model. And actually, I'm going to put my hands up and say that I didn't put all of the tiny ones on. But if anyone can really spot the tiny ones I didn't put on, fair play to them. Having applied all the transfers, some micro sol from the red bottle was then brushed over the top to further enhance the setting effect and really make them appear as if they were painted on. I used RLM 70 on the propeller blades, and then when that was dry I also gave it a coat of clear gloss. That's because there are some transfers that need to go on the propeller which I've forgotten about. And once again these transfers were applied in exactly the same way as before. When that was dry, I did make a point to paint the centre of the hub of the propeller in RLM 01 silver, and I had also painted this onto the back plate of the propeller spinner. The propeller could then be assembled by joining the back plate to the propeller and then the spinner over the top. I gave the cannons on the wings and the machine guns on the nose a coat of gunmetal grey, and then I very carefully removed my parts which were acting as masks on the bottom of the plane. This was so I could glue in my landing gear legs, which I built and painted earlier. The wheels could then be glued in on their relevant axles. And I also made sure not to forget the tail wheel, which has been suitably painted. The engine exhausts were glued into their slots on the nose of the aircraft, having already been given a coat of gunmetal paint. The propeller is actually designed to go into the aircraft before you close the fuselage half so that it can spin freely. Because I'm installing it at this point, I need to cut this retaining part of the pin off so that I can actually fit it onto the nose. Once that was done, I glued it into place. I'm not too fussed about having it freely rotate. And now some SMS Premium Flat Clear Varnish was airbrushed over the entire model. This is to help dull down that gloss coat I applied earlier and also protect the transfers. This should help seal them into the surface, prevent any yellowing or peeling away with age. I did add some slight gun smoke residue to the aircraft using some very thinned down black paint and working in the direction of airflow. This wasn't the neatest application that I've done, but I think for a bit of a representation it will do the job for now. When that was dry, I applied some very simple chipping using some Humbrol 01 Primer Grey in the various areas that I thought maybe would have had a little bit of paint worn away during the use or maintenance of the aircraft. And then, thanks to a recommendation from James at LPJ Models, I've bought some Infini superfine black lycra rigging. A small amount of super glue was added to the aerial mast, and then this fine rigging elastic held in place until it cured. I then repeated the process to glue it to the top of the aerial mast on the tail. I would also replicate this to add some that runs the aerial between the fuselage and the aerial wire, which you can see in the finished shots later. Those CT scale models masks were then carefully peeled away, and yeah, they've done a really good job of masking the canopy. I then very carefully broke the seal on the cockpit canopy so that I could open it and glue it into place in the open position so we could see the pilot. And that's pretty much it. I'm going to consider this part of the build almost like the out of the box completed part of the build. So, what do I think of this kit? Well, objectively, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. The transfers are fantastic. They're printed by Cartograph. They're really good. The instructions are easy enough to follow. And the plastic parts are relatively well detailed. They did feature a little bit of flash in a few places, but the fit of the parts is quite good. The canopy was a bit of a letdown, not being the clearest plastic that I've seen, but this kit is a little old now, so I'm not surprised that it maybe isn't as good as it probably was when it was first tooled. So speaking about the tooling date of this kit, it actually dates from 2012, but interestingly the kit I have here, this version actually dates from 2018. So if I think about it, that canopy shouldn't be as bad as it was because there's only 6 years between it. One thing that I do like that Airfix do is on the box they do actually indicate to you the tooling age and the release of the kit, so you know kind of at a glance what kind of quality might be inside the box, and it's definitely something that I wish other companies would do. You only get one paint scheme inside the kit, and at the time when I bought this one it was £6.99, which is quite a nice price for this particular model. However, as time has gone by, prices have inevitably creeped up. Airfix generally have this kind of tooling in their range at some point. It never seems to really leave it, but often it's repackaged in a different paint scheme. But no doubt the price of that one will be a little bit higher today than it was back in 2018. As mentioned previously, Airfix do indicate that this is a skill level 1 on the side of the box, and whilst the kit isn't too difficult to assemble, I would disagree with the skill level. The fact that it has that rather complicated paint scheme, not to mention the fact that you've got a variety of different camouflage colours and you've got mottling to complete as well, does push this into a slightly more complicated bracket. And I wouldn't recommend this particular paint scheme to a beginner. I certainly wouldn't have attempted this when I was new to modelling. I mean, I've only just done this now and I've been modelling for a few years. Also, there were quite a lot of decals, and although the decals are fantastic, I just got so frustrated and bored of having to put on the really tiny ones. I'm sure the perfectionists would love putting them on, but personally, if I can't notice it's not there, it's not a problem to me. Coming to talk about the painting of the kit, on the whole I'm quite happy. However, I feel the mottling has let me down a little bit. I can't wholeheartedly say it was the airbrush's fault, but being a 0.3mm nozzle, it probably wasn't the finest for this kind of work. The airbrush on the whole was fairly forgiving, and I managed to get through the entire build without having to clean it out too many times. I did find it relatively easy to use. But yeah, I think I just need a bit more practice with modelling. Perhaps I need to play around with my paint thinning ratios and also the pressures of the air coming from the compressor, just to try and avoid the sort of running and spider webbing that I was getting. I found that free sample of the CT scale model mask to be really easy to use and has given really good results on the Canopy, but the AML mask I purchased, whilst it worked brilliantly and it stuck to the model and the shapes are really good, I just wasn't a fan of the fact you had to mask the dark colours rather than the light ones, because that just seems backwards to me. I do quite enjoy using the Vallejo paints, however I find that you get tip dry with them, so adding a drop of thinner does help to alleviate that problem. Oh, and that Ammo MIG liquid putty, that was pretty good actually. I do need to experiment with it a little bit more, but for this build I think it worked quite well. So yeah, I've built a couple of these kits now. I think this is probably the most complicated paint scheme I've done on a Bf109. And for trying out different techniques and new products, it's been a good challenge. I think though, maybe we should push it just a little bit further and pair it with some other things. So if you've stuck around until now, congratulations, it's time for a bonus diorama. I've had this Vintage Classics set of Luftwaffe figures in my stash for quite a while and I need an excuse to use them, so I thought this would be a good chance. I selected the ones that I wanted and cut them from their little sprues. I'm not a fan of the plastic they use on this. It's not hard, it's kind of rubbery and flexible, and you can have the paint flake off. I also found that cutting away the mould seams on the sides, there is quite a bit of flash and mould seams which I needed to clean up, but even actually I found in the finished figures you could still see the mould seams. It was a bit disappointing. But having done that and them now being ready, it's time to get some paint on them. I applied this Humbrol grey primer over the 3 figures that I've chosen, and I'm hoping that this will actually help paint stick to the plastic. Once that was done, I gave them a light zenithal highlight using this white Hobbycraft spray paint. This is just done from above to try and give the impression of the sun shining down and those areas of the figures being lighter. Army Painter Peachy Flesh was used on all of their skin. And then for their generic uniform colour, I've gone for this US Navy Sea Blue. I'm not really going for accuracy, just what I think looks about right. After this, I painted their boots and a few other little elements in black paint. And then used this brown colour on this workman's toolbox. This earth brown paint was used on this officer's sort of jacket. I did add a little bit of black into the mix as well because I found it to be a little bit light, but I think this shade will do. When that was done and everything was dry, some Humbrol No. 1 Primer Grey was dry brushed over all of the figures to try and bring out some of the contrast and highlight the raised details. I then carefully removed the figures from their bases and removed some of that horrible rubbery plastic. And for the base of the diorama, I'm going with this black poster which I bought from a home hardware shop a little while ago. I mixed up some brown paint with some PVA glue to create a kind of mud and painted that onto the base. After this, I sprinkled on a variety of flocks, some sort of foamy sponge particles and then some static grass to give slightly different textures. Making sure, of course, to tap off the excess and save it for reuse. I then positioned the aircraft where I thought it would look quite good and superglued the 3 figures into place, into a position where perhaps they're having a conversation prior to the pilot starting his engine and taking off for his mission of the day. And with that, I think I can call it complete now. It's not an overly complicated diorama, it's fairly simple, but I think it just adds a little bit of extra weight to the build of the aircraft. It adds a little more visual interest and also uses up some of those figures which I've had in my stash just sitting around for a few years now, not doing a great deal. I have been thinking of building more dioramas recently, and it's nice to think that I've managed to help one of these aircraft get into a slightly more interesting display base. I think though it's probably time to wrap this one up here. This is a rather simple kit, which is kind of a pillar of the Airfix range, especially in 1/72 scale. It's not exactly one of their newer toolings, but it still holds up reasonably well as part of their current range. Naturally, if you can get one cheap enough, then it's an absolute bargain. However, I do find the paint scheme on this one to be a little more complicated than the skill level that was indicated on the box. There are certainly areas of this aircraft that I've identified that could be improved, particularly that mottling. Maybe I just need more practice. Once again, I'd like to thank Gallery for the free sample of the Mobius airbrush to try out. I found it to be okay to use, but I'm not sure it was quite the right product for the fine mottling on this aircraft today. But for the blanket colours, it worked alright. Also thanks to CT Scale Models for trying out their Canopy masks. Another great product, and I'd be keen on getting some more of those in the future. Once again, thanks to my channel members and patrons, allowing me to purchase extra accessories such as those airmail masks, that liquid putty, and the paint set which I used to complete this build. If you'd like to help support the channel in other ways, there are different options too. And again, full information is underneath the video. The best way to help support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, it's time to put this 2-month project to bed. I mean, granted, I probably didn't take 2 months solid, I've been very busy with other things, but I'm glad that it's now finally over so I can move on to other kits and get them out of my stash. So yeah, the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. So Airfix Bf109E-4 build and review, sync, because I know, even though I've changed the settings again, I'm always changing the settings, even though I've changed the settings, it'd probably be out of sync. So hopefully now it isn't. Right, let's do this one. I think that second part, sync. Next part, clap. I have to do this in parts because otherwise I just go crazy. It's just a lot. It's a lot to do in one go. Part 5, sync. Oh, 2 months. 2 months to get this one done, and this recording has taken over an hour. And I don't even know how long the edit's going to take. It takes like 10 minutes per finished minute of edit, and that's just sitting there editing. That doesn't count the rendering, that doesn't count like photos or writing stuff down. Didn't talk about my book, always forgetting my book. There's loads in there, absolutely loads of notes, all loads of different products I used during this. Yeah, I mean, if you watch my channel by now, you know about my book. But yeah, that's it done. What should we do next? What should we pick next to get out of the stash?